In the summer of 1099, the most devout army in Europe arrived at the gates of the Holy City. They had walked 3 years through deserts, mountains, and fields of death. They had survived hunger, plague, and endless armies. And now, under the scorching sun of Judea, they gazed upon the golden walls of Jerusalem, the place where Christ had walked, where he had died, where he had risen. Tears ran down faces hardened by war. Some fell to their knees, others raised their swords toward the sky and swore they would take the city or die trying. But within those ancient walls, another faith also prayed. Muslims and Jews watched from the towers, preparing to defend their home against the approaching storm. And when that storm finally broke, the world changed forever. The gates gave way, the walls crumbled, and then something began that not even the chroniclers of the time could describe without horror. Swords fell upon unarmed men, arrows pierced women as they fled. Children were dragged through the streets. In the Al-Aqsa Mosque, soldiers rode among corpses until the blood reached their knees. And in the main synagogue, where hundreds of Jews had taken refuge to pray one last prayer, torches were thrown. Flames consumed the building while the Crusaders formed a circle around it, singing hymns of adoration as the screams from within mingled with the crackling of fire. When dawn arrived, Jerusalem was no longer a city of 3 religions. It was a smoking cemetery, and the echo of that night would resonate through the centuries, fueling wars, vengeance, and a hatred that would never fully heal. To understand how the world arrived at that day in July, one must go back 4 years to a field in the heart of France. In November of 1095, Pope Urban II addressed a crowd of nobles, knights, and clergy gathered in the city of Clermont. His voice resonated like thunder over the plain. He spoke of holy places in the east, profaned by infidels. He spoke of Christian pilgrims attacked, robbed, murdered on the roads to Jerusalem. He spoke of a land crying out to be liberated, and then he pronounced the words that would ignite an entire continent. God wills it. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Knights tore cloth from their cloaks to sew crosses upon their chests. Peasants abandoned their fields. Nobles sold their lands. Monks left their monasteries. Within months, an army unlike any Europe had seen since the days of Rome began to form. Some estimates speak of 100,000 souls marching eastward, though only a fraction would live to see the walls of the Holy City. The road to Jerusalem was a calvary of biblical proportions. The so-called People's Crusade, led by Peter the Hermit, departed first, a disorganized mass of peasants and fanatics who left a trail of blood across Europe. In the cities of the Rhine, they massacred entire Jewish communities before even leaving Christian territory. When they finally crossed into Anatolia, the Seljuk Turks annihilated them almost completely. The survivors joined the main force, the Prince's Crusade, commanded by the great nobles of the West. Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, marched with his brothers Eustace and Baldwin. Raymond of Toulouse, the richest and most experienced, led the Provençals. Robert of Normandy, son of England's conqueror, rode alongside Robert of Flanders. And Bohemond of Taranto, the cunning Norman from Italy, advanced with his nephew Tancred, both dreaming of kingdoms of their own in the east. They crossed the Balkans, passed through Constantinople under the distrustful gaze of Byzantine Emperor Alexios Komnenos, and entered enemy territory. In June of 1097, they took Nicaea. A month later, they crushed the Turks at Dorylaeum. Then came Antioch, a brutal 8-month siege that nearly destroyed the Crusader army before treachery opened the city's gates. Inside Antioch, surrounded by a Muslim relief army, the Crusaders discovered what they claimed was the Holy Lance, the very spear that had pierced Christ's side. The discovery restored their broken faith, and in a desperate sortie, they defeated the besieging army. But disputes among the leaders delayed the march for months. At Ma'arat al-Nu'man, the hunger became so extreme that some chroniclers recorded acts of cannibalism among the Crusaders. Finally, in January of 1099, the army resumed its march southward. By the time they reached the hills of Judea in June of 1099, the army that had departed from Europe had been drastically reduced. Of the tens of thousands who crossed the Bosphorus, barely 14,000 men remained, including approximately 1,200 mounted knights. They were exhausted, hungry, many of them sick. Their armor was rusted, their horses thin, their provisions nearly depleted. But when they saw Jerusalem gleaming under the midday sun, something changed in their faces. 3 years of suffering, 3 years of death, 3 years of unbreakable faith had brought them here. The holy city stood before them, and nothing in the world would stop them. Jerusalem in the year 1099 did not belong to the Seljuk Turks, who had provoked the crusade. A year earlier, the Fatimids of Egypt had wrested it from their Sunni rivals, establishing a garrison under the command of Governor Iftikhar ad-Dawla. He was a competent administrator and an experienced military man. When he learned the Crusaders were approaching, he took drastic measures. He expelled all Eastern Christians from the city, fearing they might open the gates to the enemy, as had happened at Antioch. He poisoned the surrounding wells. He cut down the trees around the walls to deprive the besiegers of wood. He reinforced the garrison with an elite force of 400 Egyptian cavalrymen and several thousand infantry, mostly Arab and Sudanese. Jerusalem's walls stretched more than 4 kilometers, 3 meters thick and 15 meters high. 5 main gates, each flanked by twin towers, offered the only points of entry. The defenders had catapults and reserves of Greek fire, the incendiary weapon the Byzantines had perfected centuries before. Iftikhar knew a relief army was on its way from Egypt. He only needed to hold out. The Crusaders arrived on June 7th and established their camps around the city. Godfrey of Bouillon, Robert of Flanders, and Tancred positioned themselves to the north. Raymond of Toulouse occupied Mount Zion to the south. But from the first moment, problems multiplied. There was not enough wood to build siege towers. Water was scarce under the relentless heat of the Palestinian summer. The poisoned wells claimed victims every day. Foraging parties were ambushed by the garrison. A first assault, launched on June 13th without adequate preparation, failed miserably. The defenders repelled the attackers with arrows, stones, and boiling oil. The Crusaders retreated, leaving dozens of corpses at the foot of the walls. During the following weeks, the situation became desperate. The soldiers drank dirty water from their own cisterns. Horses died of thirst. Men fell ill by the dozens. Desertions began to increase. Disputes among the leaders threatened to destroy the army's cohesion. Raymond and Godfrey barely spoke to each other. Tancred had changed allegiance, abandoning Raymond to join Godfrey. The dream of the Crusade seemed to be vanishing under the scorching sun of Judea. Then salvation came from the sea. On June 17th, 6 Genoese ships docked at the port of Jaffa, loaded with provisions, tools, and most importantly, engineers expert in constructing siege machines. Guglielmo Embriaco, the Genoese commander, offered his services to the Crusader leaders. His carpenters dismantled the ships to obtain wood. Armed parties scoured distant forests for more material. During 3 frantic weeks, the Crusader camp transformed into a giant workshop. They built 2 enormous siege towers mounted on wheels, wooden structures lined with ox hides soaked in vinegar to resist Greek fire. They fabricated a battering ram with an iron head. They assembled dozens of scaling ladders and wicker screens to protect the men advancing toward the walls. Gaston of Béarn supervised the construction of Godfrey's tower in the north. William Ricot directed Raymond's in the south. Every night the forges burned until dawn. Every day the men worked under the sun without rest. And meanwhile, a priest named Peter Desiderius had a vision. The spirit of the late Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy, the papal legate who had died at Antioch, appeared to him with precise instructions. The Crusaders were to fast, repent of their sins, and march barefoot around the walls of Jerusalem, as the Israelites had done at Jericho. On July 8th, 15,000 ragged and hungry pilgrims began the procession. Barefoot, dressed in tattered tunics, they walked around the city while priests chanted psalms and trumpeters sounded their instruments. From the walls, the Muslim defenders mocked them, shouting insults and desecrating crosses within sight of all. But the Crusaders did not respond. They continued their march until they reached the Mount of Olives, where the hermit Peter preached a sermon that set their hearts ablaze. That night, the leaders who had been on the verge of war with each other reconciled. Raymond and Godfrey embraced publicly. The army was united again, and in the eyes of every man burned a flame that no water could extinguish. On July 10th, the siege towers were complete. They were formidable constructions, 3 stories tall, capable of transporting dozens of soldiers to the level of the battlements. The defenders, who had observed their construction with growing alarm, concentrated their catapults in front of the points where the towers seemed destined to attack. But Godfrey had a plan. On the night of July 13th to 14th, under the cover of darkness, his men dismantled the northern tower piece by piece and moved it to a new position further east, where the defenses were weaker. When dawn broke, the defenders discovered with horror that they would have to reposition all their machines. The final assault began on the morning of July 14th. The 2 towers advanced slowly toward the walls, pushed by dozens of men, while others held wicker screens to protect them from arrows. The defenders responded with everything they had. Catapults hurled enormous rocks that made the wooden structures tremble. Arrows rained from the battlements. Greek fire hissed against the soaked hides, but failed to ignite. Throughout the day, the battle raged without either side yielding ground. In the south, Raymond's tower became stuck in a ditch the defenders had dug during the night. His men worked frantically to fill it, while arrows whistled around them. In the north, Godfrey's tower advanced centimeter by centimeter, but the defenders bombarded it mercilessly. When night fell, neither had reached the walls. July 15th dawned with a clear sky and suffocating heat. The Crusaders resumed the assault before dawn, determined to finish what they had started. Godfrey's tower, repaired during the night, advanced toward the northern wall with renewed momentum. Inside it, the best warriors of the army awaited the moment of truth. Godfrey himself was on the upper floor, alongside his brother Eustace and a handful of chosen knights. The defenders fought with desperation. They hurled incendiary torches, fired crossbows, threw stones with their bare hands. But the tower kept advancing. Toward midday, the structure finally touched the wall. A wooden bridge descended from the upper floor, and Godfrey of Bouillon leaped onto it. He was the first to set foot on the battlements of Jerusalem. His men followed in waves, screaming Christ's name as their swords cut the air. The defenders in that sector fell back before the avalanche. Within minutes, a stretch of the northern wall was in Crusader hands. Ludolf of Tournai planted the first standard. More ladders rose against the stones. Soldiers climbed like furious ants, pouring over the battlements in an unstoppable tide. Someone opened one of the main gates from inside. The Crusader army entered the Holy City like an overflowing river. In the south, Raymond finally managed to overcome the defenses, and his provincials burst through the Mount Zion sector. Iftikhar ad-Dawla, seeing that all was lost, retreated to the Tower of David with what remained of the elite garrison. From there, he negotiated his surrender with Raymond, who guaranteed him safe passage in exchange for handing over the citadel. The Fatimid governor and his men left Jerusalem that very night, marching toward Ascalon. They were the only defenders who survived. What followed was a slaughter that horrifies even across the distance of centuries. The Crusaders spread through the streets of Jerusalem with a bloodlust that no plea could quench. There were no orders for quarter. There was no mercy for anyone. Men, women, children, the elderly, all fell beneath the swords of the conquerors. Raymond of Aguilera, chaplain to the Count of Toulouse and an eyewitness, later wrote about what he saw. It was necessary to pick one's way over the bodies of men and horses. But these were small matters compared to what happened at the Temple of Solomon. In the Temple and Porch of Solomon, men rode in blood up to their knees and bridle reins. Indeed, it was a just and splendid judgment of God that this place should be filled with the blood of unbelievers. The chronicler of the Gesta Francorum, another eyewitness source, described how the Crusaders pursued and killed the defenders as far as Solomon's temple, where the slaughter was so great that our men waded in blood up to their ankles. Thousands of Muslims had sought refuge in the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, the holiest sites of Islam in Jerusalem. They hoped the sanctity of the place would protect them, or at least that they could negotiate their surrender. Tancred, Bohemond's nephew, arrived first and offered them his protection in exchange for their submission. He raised his purple standard over the mosque as a sign that those refugees were under his custody. But his fellow Crusaders ignored the promise. They burst into the sanctuaries and began a systematic massacre. Muslim sources speak of 10,000 dead on the Temple Mount alone. Ibn al-Athir, the Arab historian who wrote more than a century later, recorded that the Franks killed more than 70,000 people in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Among them, a large group of imams, religious scholars, devout men, and ascetics. The figures are probably exaggerated, but the scale of the massacre was undeniable. Robert the monk wrote that the blood flowed so forcefully that it carried severed limbs and heads down the avenues of the city, leaving piles of unrecognizable body parts. And then there were the Jews of Jerusalem. The Jewish community had lived in the city for generations, under Muslim rulers who tolerated them as people of the book. When the Crusaders broke through the walls, many Jews fought alongside the Muslim defenders, knowing what awaited them if the city fell. The massacres of the Rhine, perpetrated by the People's Crusade 4 years earlier, had shown the world what Crusaders did to Jews. When the defenses collapsed, the Jews of Jerusalem fled to their main synagogue. Some accounts speak of the Jerusalem synagogue in the Jewish quarter. Others mention several synagogues. The sources agree on what happened next. According to Ibn al-Qalanisi, the chronicler of Damascus, the Jews assembled in their synagogue and the Franks burned it over their heads. Other sources describe how the Crusaders raised their shields and formed a circle around the burning building, singing hymns while the people trapped inside died, burning alive. Estimates of the number of victims vary between 300 and several thousand people. A Jewish letter written just 2 weeks after the siege confirms the destruction of the synagogue, though it does not specifically mention that there were people inside when it was burned. It is possible that some had escaped beforehand, but the fate of Jerusalem's Jewish community was sealed that day. The few survivors were taken prisoner. Tancred took some as prisoners of war and sent them to Italy, where many died along the way, thrown into the sea or beheaded. Others were ransomed by Jewish communities from Ascalon and Alexandria over the following months. By the summer of 1100, nearly all who could be freed had been. Those who could not be ransomed were forced to convert to Christianity or were executed. The Jewish presence in Jerusalem, which had existed continuously for more than 1,000 years, was eradicated in a single day. The massacre continued for 2 days. Albert of Aachen, who was not present but compiled testimonies from survivors who returned to Europe, wrote that even after the first wave of slaughter, there was another on the 3rd day after the victory. The leaders pronounced judgment, and everyone seized weapons and surged forth for a wretched massacre of all the crowd of Gentiles which was still left, those whom they had previously spared for the sake of money and human pity. The streets filled with corpses to such an extent that the stench became unbearable. The Crusader leaders ordered Muslim prisoners to drag the bodies outside the city and pile them into enormous funeral pyres. Robert of Normandy wrote that no one had ever seen or heard of such slaughter of pagan people, for funeral pyres were formed from them like pyramids, and no one knows their number except God alone. When the carnage finally ended, the Crusaders washed their blood-stained hands and walked to the holiest place in Christendom. Godfrey of Bouillon led a barefoot procession through streets still slippery with blood to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the place where, according to tradition, Christ had been buried and had risen. The warriors who had massacred thousands fell to their knees and wept with joy. They sang hymns of thanksgiving. They kissed the sacred ground. For them, the massacre was not a crime, but a purification, the fulfillment of a divine mission. Raymond of Aguilers, the same one who described the rivers of blood, contemplated the scene with religious ecstasy and wrote that it was a day of jubilation and rejoicing, a new song to the Lord. On July 17th, 2 days after the conquest, the Crusader leaders gathered to decide who would govern the city. Raymond of Toulouse was the first candidate, but he rejected the title, claiming he would not wear a crown of gold where Christ had worn one of thorns. It is possible his refusal was sincere, or perhaps he hoped others would follow his example and the position would remain vacant. But Godfrey of Bouillon accepted the leadership under a different title. He called himself Advocatus Sancti Sepulchri, defender of the Holy Sepulchre instead of king. The distinction was subtle but important. He would not claim royalty over the city where Christ had reigned from the cross. Raymond, enraged by the outcome, tried to seize the Tower of David before leaving Jerusalem to pursue his own conquests in the north. On August 1st, Arnulf of Schock was elected the first Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, ignoring the claims of the Greek Orthodox clergy who had served in the city for centuries. 5 days later, Arnulf announced the discovery of a relic of the true cross, supposedly the very wood on which Christ had died. The discovery, convenient and timely, cemented the religious legitimacy of the new kingdom. The mosques of the Temple Mount were converted into churches. The Dome of the Rock became the Templum Domini, Temple of the Lord. The Al-Aqsa Mosque became the Templum Salomonis, Temple of Solomon, and decades later would be the headquarters of the Knights Templar. But the conquest was not complete. In mid-August, a Fatimid army of approximately 20,000 men arrived from Egypt under the command of Vizier Al-Afdal. If they had arrived a few weeks earlier, history would have been different. Godfrey gathered his forces, barely 1,200 knights and 9,000 infantry, and marched south to confront the threat. On August 12th, outside Ascalon, the Crusaders launched a surprise attack at dawn. The Egyptians, confident in their numerical superiority, were caught completely off guard. Panic seized their ranks. Many fled to a sycamore grove that the Crusaders set on fire. Others were pushed toward the sea. The vizier's standard was captured. By the end of the day, the Fatimid army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Jerusalem was secure. When news of the conquest reached Europe, it was received with delirious jubilation. Church bells rang from Rome to London. Priests preached about the miracle of the liberation of the Holy Land. Chroniclers compared the Crusaders to the Israelites who had conquered Canaan under Joshua. The massacre was not hidden. On the contrary, it was celebrated as proof of divine favor. God had delivered his enemies into the hands of the faithful. The bloodshed was the price of redemption. Pope Urban II, whose call at Clermont had started it all, died on July 29th of 1099, just 2 weeks after the fall of Jerusalem. He never knew his crusade had triumphed, but But in the Islamic world, the reaction was one of horror and rage. Ibn al-Athir described it as a disaster without precedent. News of the massacre spread from Damascus to Baghdad, from Cairo to Cordoba. Preachers cried out for vengeance. Poets lamented the desecration of holy places. The memory of that July day would fuel calls for jihad for generations. When Saladin reconquered Jerusalem 88 years later in 1187, his treatment of the Christian inhabitants was remarkably different. He offered generous terms of surrender. He allowed most of the defenders to depart unmolested. Saladin's mercy was deliberate, a calculated contrast with the brutality of the Crusaders that he remembered and that his people had never forgotten. The Kingdom of Jerusalem would survive nearly 2 centuries, a chain of fortresses and coastal cities ruled by European lords in a land that was never fully theirs. But the city itself would change hands several more times. Saladin took it in 1187. Frederick II recovered it briefly through diplomacy in 1229. The Khwarezmians sacked it in 1244. Finally, the Mamluks incorporated it into their sultanate, where it would remain under Muslim rule for centuries. Godfrey of Bouillon, the defender of the Holy Sepulchre, died barely a year after the conquest, possibly of typhus, though some suspected poisoning. His brother Baldwin, who had established his own county in Edessa, was crowned the first king of Jerusalem on Christmas Day of the year 1100, accepting the title Godfrey had rejected. Under his rule, the kingdom expanded and consolidated, but the seeds of its destruction were already planted. The Crusader states never had enough men to defend their vast territories. They depended on constant reinforcements from Europe that arrived irregularly, and they were surrounded by enemies who, though divided at first, would eventually find unity under leaders like Zengi, Nur ad-Din, and finally Saladin. Today, Jerusalem's walls still rise under the same sun that shone upon the massacre of 1099. The holy places of the 3 religions coexist in a tiny space, guarded by fragile treaties and eternal tensions. On the esplanade of the Temple Mount, where blood ran up to the horsemen's knees, Muslims pray in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. In the Jewish quarter, rebuilt after centuries, the descendants of those who were burned alive in the synagogues now walk freely through the streets. In the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, Christian pilgrims kiss the stone where Christ's body supposedly rested. The echoes of that summer of 1099 have never stopped resonating. The First Crusade established a pattern of religious violence that would repeat for 200 years of holy wars. The massacre of Jerusalem demonstrated that faith, in its most extreme form, could turn devout men into merciless killers and transform an act of liberation into a crime against humanity. The words of the chroniclers, both those who celebrated the massacre and those who mourned it, cross the centuries like a warning carved in blood and fire. Because on that day in July, when the gates of the holy city yielded to the hammers of faith, something more than a city was conquered. A wound was opened between civilizations, a wound that still bleeds. And in the ancient stones of Jerusalem, where every street holds the memory of 1,000 battles, the ghost of that summer remains, whispering through the centuries that some victories cost more than any world can afford to pay.